Obviously, we're here this afternoon to talk about transportation funding for independent schools and private ECS operators. For the most part, a lot of this information in this session will apply to both types of authorities, but there will be different parts that apply to only independent schools or ECS operators, particularly a couple of the funding eligibility pieces. Obviously, ECS is funded at 100%, and grade 1 to 12 independent school students are funded at 70%. So that's a key difference that we'll explain in the next few slides. And as we get further into the presentation, we have two different application forms that are very similar, but there are a couple of little differences. So just keep in mind that I'll do my best to kind of differentiate if there's a slide that only applies to one type of authority or another. I'll point that out as we go through. So. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So first part of the presentation, we'll talk about funding criteria. Sure, everybody's familiar with the funding manual for school authorities, and Section D speaks to independent schools, and Section E speaks to private ECS schools. Section D, Section 3.2, and it's 3.2 and Section E as well, refer to the transportation funding criteria. Recognizing that some of that information points back to the funding that school authorities get. So sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge for me. Okay, what does this actually mean for me? And I get that. And I'm hoping today's presentation will just kind of put that in plain language, because some of the funding is based on what the local school authority in your jurisdiction gets and whatnot. But certainly 3.2 and Section D and Section E are the places to look at with regards to the funding criteria. Certainly you can look in Section C as well, which speaks to school authorities, but that might leave you more confused. But at the end of the day, that's where you would look for the funding criteria. And there is good information, particularly with regards to fee requirements in both sections of the funding manual with regards to fees for independent schools and transportation fees and ECS operators and some of the criteria there. We'll talk about that in the presentation as well. Glossary of terms is something, anytime we're presenting to any authority, glossary of terms is also a good place for key definitions. Anything that you see bolded in the funding manual is a defined term. So then you would go to the glossary terms, I think Section M. Towards the end of the funding manual, we'll maybe jump into the funding manual after the presentation, just walk you through that a little bit. That's where you would see any of those key definitions. One key thing, and we'll mention it a few times in the presentation, any documentation with regards to student transportation, your application form, your routing information, if you're doing parent provided, your parent provided agreements, student lists of who's riding on buses, all that kind of information needs to be kept for 7 years. So that's standard retention requirements for anything with regards to student transportation funding. So a couple key reminders with regards to the funding before we get into the specific funding allocations. Funding is only provided for eligible transported students. We'll talk about the eligibility criteria right away, but you'll hear it quite a bit. It's 1 kilometer for kindergarten to grade 6 students and 2 kilometers for grade 7 to 12 students. So that's the key criteria. Students that are 1 kilometer, K to 6 students that are 1 kilometer or greater from your school, from the school they're attending, or grade 7 to 12 students that are 2 kilometers or greater from the school they're attending. If they're transported, they would be eligible for funding. And so we'll talk about what transportation means, whether it's by yellow bus or by parent provided agreement. That's typically the types of modes of transportation that we're hearing for independent schools and private ECS operators. The other piece that's a key thing that was introduced into the funding model for the upcoming school year for all school authorities, including school boards and charter schools, that transportation funding is now targeted. And it's intended to only be used for the transportation of students to and from school. It's not intended to support the cost of extracurricular trips. Can maybe talk about the capital piece a little bit. Certainly if you're an operator in an independent school that operates your own fleet, certainly the capital costs, although typically Alberta Education Funding isn't to be used for capital costs for independent schools, we would consider it reasonable for things like buses, obviously, to update your fleet or enhance your fleet, or to replace old buses. Certainly that would be a reasonable capital request, capital expense that you could spend those dollars towards. If you have other questions about capital, I'll probably recommend that you just reach out to me by email, and we can have those discussions offline. Right. Next slide. So this, we're going to talk a little bit about funding specific to private ECS operators. And you see the term at the top of the slide, it talks about regular transportation funding. What we're talking about here is just regular students that don't have any disabilities or anything that would prevent them from riding a regular bus. These are, for the most part, these are going to be the students that that you're educating. Certainly private ECS operators sometimes have quite often actually have a mix of both and maybe have more of a specialized student profile. So we'll talk about funding there in a minute. But for students that could ride a regular bus, funding is pretty straightforward. It's $703 per eligible child that's transported, regardless if they're in a rural or an urban setting. Like we said, children that are in ECS to grade 6, so obviously ECS students for ECS operators have to reside 1 kilometer or more from the program that they're attending. Measuring the distance, that's probably a key learning curve piece that everybody will have to figure out. We tried to make it a little bit easier this year. We've changed the criteria a little bit as far as how distance is measured. We now consider it'd be appropriate that distance can be measured using the driving distance from the student's residence to your school. In the past, we would have incorporated things like walking routes and whatnot, but we've changed our eligibility criteria and our distance measurement criteria to reflect that it will be based on driving distance moving forward. So certainly it's pretty straightforward, no different than if you're trying to use Google to get to a location. You would just use that type of a tool from the student's residence to to your school. So recognized for authorities being this their first year, there'll be a lot of extra work this year to kind of gather that data. But then once you have that distance information, as long as the student doesn't move and they're continuing to attend your program in subsequent years, obviously you're not going to be updating that distance criteria. You're just going to be focusing on new students moving forward. But certainly for this summer, and certainly in some of the independent operators, schools that I've talked to, certainly concerned about the amount of work it takes to kind of gather that information. And certainly depending on the size of your program, certainly you might have, a few hundred students that you need to figure out distance for, but usually within an afternoon, it's just a matter of just copying and pasting those addresses into Google and just having it calculate to your school, and it should be pretty straightforward. We talk about transportation modes. Typically, it's going to be by bus, usually yellow bus, parent. Sometimes we'll also see taxi or aids, particularly for ECS operators used to transport students that are maybe going to a community program or whatnot. So that's the main modes of transportation for regular transportation, and it's $703 per student, 100% funding if they reside 1 kilometer or greater from the program. Right, so here we'll talk about transportation funding for independent schools. Here funding is based a little bit more based on the local urban or rural transportation rate of the local school, the local public or separate school jurisdiction in your area. Certainly we recognize that some independent schools in particular draw from a fairly wide geographical area that might encompass a few different school jurisdictions. Maybe you're just on the edge of Calgary, on the edge of Edmonton. Some authorities I've talked to in Southern Alberta encompass a couple of different public school jurisdictions down there. We would use the rates based on the jurisdiction where the school is residing. That would be kind of our base for that. We may adjust the funding a little bit based on where your students are coming from. We would kind of work that individually with each individual authority. But from a funding perspective, we'll talk about rates here in a minute, but from a funding perspective, I'll be 100% funding for ECS children and then 70% funding for grade 1 to 12 students. We kind of talk a little bit, and you'll see that differentiation sometimes in this presentation. When we talk about children, we specifically are talking about ECS children, and then when we talk about students, unless we specify it otherwise, we're talking about grade 1 to 12 students. So the distance criteria is pointed out here. It's 1 kilometer, like I said, for kindergarten to grade 6, and then 2 kilometers for grade 7 to 12. We talk about how distance is measured, and then again, transported by bus, parent, taxi, or aid. So we talk a little bit more about rates for independent schools in a rural area. We're going to take a look at the funding of where the students reside. And so I'm just thinking about some of the conversations I've had with a few authorities that might draw from both students from both an urban or a rural area. We'll talk about that when we get into the application. The rate that you get for the student may depend on where they reside. If they're in a rural area and don't live in an area that's more than 10,000 people, they're considered a rural student, whether they live in a rural location or in a smaller town that's less than 10,000 people. The rural transportation rate is going to apply. And there's 3 figures that apply to the transportation. If my mouse is going to show up here, maybe I'll try and highlight this. So there's three pieces here that that are used to factor into the calculation for rural transportation. So there's a rural transportation rate. We'll talk about that. There's a distance funding amount, and then there's a weighting factor. And so we break down these three components here further down in the slide. And so the rural transportation rate, like I said, applies to students riding in rural areas or in a population center less than 10,000 people. It'll be determined by the local school board's density rate. And that'll be hard coded into the applications when you put your jurisdiction code into the school authority code into the application form. It'll automatically provide the rate for your area. So you don't have to worry about figuring that out. We'll calculate that all over the summer and put those rates in ahead of time. If you're wondering what your rate is for maybe for funding purposes or planning purposes, feel free to reach out. We can certainly help you out with that. But like it says here, it's established prior to the submission of the application. And if you reside in an area where there's both public and Catholic school divisions operating, it would be the lesser of the two rates. So that's the first thing. So you're going to get a base rate for every student that meets the distance criteria of 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers. And then there's going to be a distance funding amount based on top of that, based on the distance to the attending in school. And that's where you're going to use Google Maps to determine the distance for each of your students. So if let's say you have a student here that's 10 kilometers away from school, you're going to get $20.33 for every kilometer. So essentially $203.30 of distance funding for that student. And so obviously the rates per kilometer go up depending on where the student's distance fits into this matrix. So you're going to get a base rate, say it's going to be $800 a student or $1,000 a student. And then you're going to get another factor on top of that, a distance. Let's just say for round numbers, it's $1,000 a base rate based on the jurisdiction, public or Catholic school jurisdiction where you reside. It's going to be $1,000 for the rural base rate. Then you're going to have the distance funding of about $200. And then the last factor that comes into there is the weighting factor. And so that's going to be a 1.0 for grades kindergarten to 6, and then 1.5 for grade 7 to 12. And the weighting factor just takes into account that if you have a bus load of students, grade 7 to 12, you're not going to be able to fit as many students in a 66 or 72 passenger bus as you would K to 6 students. That would be 3 to a seat. And so that's where the weighting factor takes into consideration. So using my fictitious example, if you had a student, your base rate was $1,000, and then you'd have, say, $200 in distance funding. So that breaks it up to $1,200. And then you'd multiply that by 1.5. So that'd be another $600 on the $1,200. So then you got $1,800 per student. And then we would multiply that by 70% for independent schools. In the urban area, we still have the same requirements. We have the urban transportation rate. We have a distance criteria and weighting factor. Those are the same whether it's urban or rural. The big difference is the base transportation rate. And in an urban and rural area, it's based on the size of the population center, not based on the school jurisdiction where your authority is located. And so there's two different rates based on population centers. There's a rate of $557 for students who reside in population centers between 10,000 and 50,000, and then a rate of $512 for students who reside in a population center of 50,000 plus. That would be your larger cities like Edmonton, Calgary, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, a couple of bigger towns too, Shore Park. So that would be the base rate there. So it's either be $557 for smaller population centers or $512 for bigger population centers. And then the same distance and funding pieces. Again, wherever you fit in that criteria, if you have a student that's 14 kilometers away, it'd be 14 times $23.99. So basically you get $23.99 for every kilometer if your student resides between 14 and 18 kilometers away from school. So that's how that works. And that funding application will provide all that information. We'll talk about that application in a minute. Basically what you're going to put in the application form is the demographic information for the student, and then you put their distance. And once we get that distance information in there, the application will automatically calculate the correct funding amount for each student. And obviously, these rates, then 70% would be applied to this as well. Talked about this a little bit earlier, but certainly if you have if you're drawing students from both urban and metro and rural areas, then you're going to be putting students on 2 different tabs within the application form. Just to go back a slide, you'll have some students that if they reside outside a population center of at least 10,000 people, they're going to be getting rural transportation funding. And then if they're urban students, they're going to be getting funded based on the urban model. So the last couple of slides talked about regular transportation for students that are riding a regular bus route. This slide talks a little bit about special transportation, which is only available for students with a disability who cannot access a regular transportation due to the severity of their disability. I don't think there's too many situations that I've heard of so far in an independent school context where they would have a segregated, separate special transportation route. So this likely will not apply to most independent schools because you're likely transporting all your students on the same route. But there will be some situations where you have an ECS operator and all their students qualify for special transportation funding. And then that's all the funding. They would be claiming all their funding based on special transportation. So it's probably an either or for most people on the call today. For bigger school boards, we often see, especially Edmonton and Calgary and other bigger centers, bigger school boards like Edmonton Public and CBE will operate both regular transportation and special transportation routes, because that is one of the key pieces of the funding, is that special transportation routes can include regular riders unless they're a sibling of the rider. So the rates are laid out here. But if you have any questions about whether you have students that qualify for special transportation funding, probably the best bet is just to reach out to Sally, Jean, or myself, and we can talk about your situation in particular. But I'm guessing you're going to be either for most independent schools, you're going to be in the rural regular or the urban regular. And then as an ECS operator, you're going to be either here or in some situations, you might have a mix of both and you might have some students here. So. All right, some other funding considerations, just some reminders. A key part of transportation funding for independent schools and private ECS operators is that funding cannot be claimed unless service is being provided. So if there's no transportation service being provided, the student's not riding the bus because they're getting a ride from mom and dad or driving themselves to school, or you don't offer bus service in that area and you choose not to offer parent provided transportation. If there's no cost incurred or no service being provided by the operator, then you can't claim funding for the student. We'll use the September count date for bus route information. Like I said, it has to be kept on file for 7 years. Keeping in mind that sometimes we get questions about different students with different disabilities and whether they qualify for regular transportation or for special transportation. Students that qualify for English as additional language programming funding are only eligible for regular transportation funding. And just a quick reminder about fees. Fees cannot exceed the total cost to provide the service less transportation funding received by Alberta Education. Given that, especially for independent schools, we're only providing 70% funding. I don't think that'd be too big of an issue. And then a lot of ECS operators don't charge fees, so that probably won't be too much of an issue there. But if you are charging fees and you're curious about making sure that it aligns with the requirements in the funding manuals, feel free to give us a call or reach out to us by email. Just a little bit more about fees. This language was taken from the funding manual. Obviously provided all school authorities, including school boards and charter schools, are prohibited from charging student transportation for students with a severe disability or delay who cannot use regular transportation services. So if you have a student on a specialized transportation route, you cannot charge a fee for that transportation fee for that student. We've talked here as well, fees must not exceed the difference between the estimated cost less the funding received from Alberta Education. We must have policies in place regarding the transportation of students along with a schedule of the transportation fees. And a lot of this language in the last two bullets is very similar to what's in the school transportation regulation, which doesn't apply to independent schools and private ECS operators, but it's very similar criteria that you have to be transparent with what your fees are. And I think most authorities are pretty good about that. They're going to let their parents know what the fee schedules are for the upcoming school year. And so make sure that you have clear transparency on what the transportation fees are for the upcoming school year, and make sure that the policies with regards to transportation and your fee schedule are published on your authority website or some other manner where parents would be able to access that information. Lots of questions about parent transportation funding. I know it was one of the things when I did a session back after budget came out, we talked about it, and I think I've clarified it with most people now, and I think I misspoke back then about whether you could do parent provided transportation or yellow bus transportation. You certainly can do a mix of both. I think my answer at that day was no, you could only do one or the other. And I think that's more from the perspective of most school authorities only do one or the other, because if they can offer yellow bus service, they're not going to enter into a parent transportation agreement. But certainly we've talked to a lot of independent schools in particular that draw students from a large geographical area with maybe not the volume of students, but certainly a large area where it just financially doesn't make sense to run a bus to every corner of the area where you're drawing students from. So you might have a smaller transportation service area where you provide yellow bus service, and then you may choose, or you don't have to. And I think that's a key piece in this, all of this, is that there's some authorities that we've talked to this year that are just choosing not to offer any kind of transportation service, whether it's yellow bus or parent provided. They haven't offered it in the past. They recognize that they could get funding if they do it, but they've just chosen to continue with the status quo. So certainly for authorities that provide yellow bus service and they choose to, but maybe not all students can access the yellow bus because the bus doesn't go far enough out to reach some of the students that are further away from the program. You could choose to enter into a parent provided transportation agreement, or you could do parent provided transportation funding for all your students and not do yellow bus at all. So this page talks a little bit more about the rates. And so again, 703 is the regular rate for transport ECS child. And then 70% of the 703 rate is $492.10 for eligible grade 1 to 12 students. Parent provided transportation agreements, and that's a key piece. And we've talked to a lot of authorities about this, that, you know, there is a little bit of work that you have to put into demonstrating that you are providing service to these parents and reimbursing them, and that be through a parent provided transportation agreement. And I know I shared those links early in the chat, and I'll share them again at the end. We'll provide in the emails as well that you do have to have an agreement with each family, and it must be signed and in place by October 31st in order for that child to be eligible for funding. And basically that agreement is basically demonstrates to us that you are providing transportation services through parent reimbursement for the school year. And so that meets that requirement for students to be transported. No administration fees can be deducted from the payment. I think I had some discussions with a few authorities where it was uncertain whether you could deduct a fee. So I apologize if the information I provided then maybe wasn't clear, but we have taken a look at it a little bit further over the last few weeks and confirmed that because independent schools and ECS operators get a system admin fee based on a percentage of their overall funding, and that would include their transportation funding. You're already getting essentially through the system admin grant, you're already getting additional funding based on your transportation funding allocation to support administering the payment back to the parent. A couple of key pieces here with regards to how parents are reimbursed. You can't withhold any portion of can't withhold any portion that is to be reimbursed to the parent. And you can't use the payment to offset student fees. Sorry, I'm getting dry already. That's a key piece that we've been very consistent on, even with school authorities and boards and charter schools and whatnot. Certainly, many independent schools do charge fees to students, and while we recognize that it's simpler from a financial perspective to just take that funding allocation, whether it's 703 or 492, and just use that to offset owing fees for the student and maybe for the current school year or for an upcoming school year. We've always taken the position that it's important that you have that complete financial transaction back to the parent. If they turn around and give that $703 right back to you for your program for student fees or whatnot, that's fine. But that money has to go direct to the parents, and then they can determine how they want to use that to offset their fees. So that's a key piece to keep in mind. So there is going to be obviously some administration in providing payments back to the parents, whether it's through checks, or maybe you have an electronic fund transfer arrangement set up with parents, but that'll be certainly a consideration as far as how you're going to reimburse parents if you decide to go down this route. Similar to what we've talked about before, you can't claim funding unless the parent is being compensated, and funding must be provided back to the parent, like I said, as a complete financial transaction. Some of the other questions that we get about parent provided transportation, obviously we'll provide the template and you can rework that for your needs. You can just have one template per family. Sometimes we get the question, what if the student leaves halfway through the year? Do you have to give them the full amount? No, you can prorate it and pay them only a portion of the amount. Say it was 703 and the student was only there for 3 months of the year and they left, then you just pay them $70.30 times 3. We consider that reasonable, even though the student is funded for the full year. As long as they're riding the bus in September, or sorry, as long as that agreement's in place by the end of October, then we consider them transported, even if they leave in November or December. So they would be funded regardless. So that's something we get asked about. We get a question sometimes, you have 2 or 3 family members in the same family. Do you have to pay the 703 for each of the students in the household, even though the parent's driving them all in one vehicle? And we really leave that up to each authority and how they want to manage that. Most authorities will just fund all those dollars right back to the parent, but some might have a little bit more in and out of students during the year, and they might only pay the 703 to the family and maybe keep the 703 for siblings to support other students that are coming into the program during the year. So you do have some flexibility on that. The key piece is that for at least the first student in the household, you need to be reimbursing the full amount that you're getting from us, assuming that they're attending for the whole year. I don't know what else, payment wise. Most authorities will wait until the end of the year. Obviously, it takes time to cut checks and do EFTs. So typically they'll just take attendance throughout the year. And as long as the student was attending regularly, they will, they'll just reimburse at the end of the year, and that's totally fine. Now, Sally Jean, we'll put you on the spot. Anything else parent provided questions we got? Is that kind of all of it?
Yeah, I'm just getting some questions if the full amount had to be paid out at once. And so I just responded that it depends on the independent school's decision. They can pay it out monthly, bi-yearly, halfway through the year, every 3 months, or just once at the end of the year. It's completely up to them.
Managing the chat. Any other questions that you wanted to bring forward? You got them all under control.
If there's a question here, Rick,
Yeah,
says your slide says we cannot withhold any portion, but I think you just said we can withhold dollars beyond the first student.
Correct. No really easy way to say both of those things, but certainly for the students that you're required to reimburse, which would be the first student in the household, you can't withhold any portion of that. If you chose to, like I said before, if you have multiple siblings in the same household, you could withhold's not the right way. I guess you'd only have to pay the amount for the first child in the household. All right, if you've got any other questions, just jump in, Sally Jean. With regards to the agreements, and I'll put a copy in the chat again here when we're finished up today. There is a template that's available. I know we shared it with quite a few authorities this spring. Some of the key pieces that we want to see in the contract, obviously, is the name and address of the eligible child, the duration of the agreement, the description of the service, payment amount, make that clear so the parent knows what they're getting for the transportation of their children, whether it's you're paying the 703 or 492 for all the students, or maybe only paying the one amount. Parent and school authority signature. Make sure there's a signature and a date. Quite often we'll see signatures, but there's no indication of when it was dated. And obviously October 31st is a key part, because we will ask for copies of these agreements, maybe not all of them, but we will take a sample of these agreements when you submit your application to make sure you have them in place. So we want to make sure that that agreement was signed and executed by both the school and the parent by the end of October. Advice we've provided to people in the past, because sometimes I always use the backpack thing, but I think through the pandemic, people just send everything electronically home now. But sometimes emails get missed and stuff gets lost at the bottom of backpacks. Certainly, it doesn't hurt when you send the contract out, just maybe put a deadline of the middle of October, just to build a little bit of a cushion into your processes to track down any parents that maybe have not submit their application in time. So you're not scrambling at the end of the month trying to get them. And, if you don't got them by the middle of October, then you got a couple of weeks to chase after parents to get them. And then, like I said, must be signed by October 31st, and we will ask for copies of contracts to confirm eligibility. A little bit about who actually, we've talked about criteria, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, and rates, but I guess probably maybe we should have started with this slide is when is a student actually even eligible for funding, regardless of whether they meet the criteria being transported and meeting the distance criteria. And so I think everybody's familiar with the September count date. Used to be September 30th with Truth and Reconciliation Days. Now September 29th is the count date for school authorities for this year. Students that are being claimed should be registered and transported by the end of September. Certainly we recognize there are some exceptions for ECS programs that start in October. They'll have an adjusted count date, and certainly know that some students that qualify for severe learning support or PUF programs, their count date is December 1st. So the application deadline is November 30th. So, and we know that kind of aligns maybe by a day with the count date for severe students. Severe children. So we talk about children, we're talking about ECS children. They have the count date is December 1st. So we would assume that, by the end of November, you would have a good idea of which students are in your program if you're operating an ECS severe learning program or a PUF program. Essentially, if your student is eligible to receive instruction funding, then they'll be eligible to receive transportation funding. Before we get into the application, we'll just talk about process a little bit. Certainly, the applications will be sent out by email. We'll send them out in the fall to all authorities. So as we build our contact lists, obviously, but not on this call, obviously, because they're not going to provide transportation, but there'll be many that'll be probably getting tired of getting emails from us by the end of the summer. But we will send the email with the application out. Typically, it's by mid-September. And then, certainly if you have questions, reach out to Sally Jeet or myself by email. But then as far as submitting the application, once you get it, you're going to be using our Strategic Financial Services SharePoint site. And some of them might be familiar with accessing it through the Provincial Education Directory link found on the Alberta Education website. But that's going to be an important piece for all of you to probably set up beforehand to make sure you access that site, because there will be other resources that we'll provide on there, such as the presentation that we shared today. We'll provide the template. The applications will be there as well in case you need a new copy of one or misplace it or whatnot. So the SharePoint site is a really good resource to not only get information from us, but it is the method that you'll submit your application back to us. We don't want you to be emailing your applications to us. Because obviously it has student information in there, ASNs and whatnot. We don't want that information to be shared by email so that there's no chance of it being compromised. The only way we'll accept applications if they're downloaded and submitted via the transportation SharePoint site. When we're done the session today, if we have a little bit of extra time, I'll walk through that site a little bit and explain to you where it goes. But essentially what you'll need to do if you're don't have access to the site already, you'll have to go on to the directory link found on the Alberta Education website and get set up for a password and get set up with the extranet account. And then you have to email in a permission form to access, like I said, the Strategic Financial Services Transportation site. Some of you might be familiar with this the SharePoint site. If you've been selected for enrollment monitoring and whatnot, you might have access to other tabs on the Strategic Financial Services site, but you might not have access to the transportation site. So it's really important that you put it in that site, not in monitoring site or school finance site or anything like that. So if you do have access to the SharePoint site, just log in when you have a moment and see if you have access to transportation or not. And if you don't, then you just have to download an application from the Provincial Education Directory page. We've provided also the application form as well, and then just submit it to client services, and then they'll get you set up on the SharePoint site. Just a little bit more about how to get the application. If you don't have a extranet password yet, you're going to go on to the education website. There's a login page on the top side. Just click in login, and then I'll open up another little button in the middle that'll say login to the Provincial Education Directory. And then it'll take you to a new window, and then you put your email address and you just click on new, sign me up, and they'll walk you through all the steps there. So should have time at the end. I'll kind of visually show you how to go through all that. And then, like I said, once you're set up with the extranet account, then you'll download you'll get the form and complete it for the transportation SharePoint site, and you'll send that by email to the help desk, and they'll help you out with getting set up with that. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days, depending on the time of year, but usually if you're not set up by a week, then just reach out to us and we'll check into it and see what's going on. But that's a key point that many people on this call today might not have access yet. So that's an important piece to get taken care of, maybe over the summer at the beginning of the school year. All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the funding application. So the next few slides are going to talk specifically to the funding application for private ECS operators. You'll see a lot of similar information on both applications, but we'll talk about the application for private ECS operators first. So the funding applications, like I said, will be sent out by the end of September, usually probably middle of September, but certainly you'll get it by the end of September at the latest. So if you don't have it by then, just reach out to Sally Jean and she'll send you a copy. Like I said, it can also be found on the SharePoint site. So that's really important for you to get set up on that. Deadline is November 30th. If you have questions, reach out to Sally Jean and she'll be able to help you out with getting the application. Or if you have questions about the information that needs to go into the application, email is better. Just because of the volume of requests that we're going to get over the fall, especially with lots of people where this process is new, we would certainly anticipate additional questions. And so sending by email is better, because if Sally Jean's got too many questions to respond to, then we can triage it and send it to myself or to Eric, and then others can respond to them. Otherwise, she's going to spend all day on the phone every day and she won't be able to answer anybody's emails. So start with an email, and then certainly if you need further clarification, you can set up a call with Sally Jean, but that's the best way to get your questions to us, is just by email to start. So for ECS operators, you're going to get an Excel spreadsheet that has 7 tabs here. So we're just going to go through each of the tabs in the application and explain a little bit about what each of the tabs talks about. And so this first one is just a general introduction to the application and all the different criteria. And it'll break down each of the tabs and what information is required. I know it's a little bit hard to see on this slide what that information is, but we'll talk about the individual spreadsheet tabs here in a minute. That explains a little bit more. But sometimes people that are used to doing applications forget about the introduction page, but it's a good resource to kind of refamiliarize yourself with what the requirements are for each of the tabs in the application. This tab is kind of a cover page or an application summary. You'll see numbers all over on this tab here, but they are all auto-populated based on the student information that you'll be putting in subsequent tabs. The only thing you really need to put on this tab is your authority code, not your school code, but put your authority code in. And if you put it in correctly, then it'll populate right here with your authority name. So that's a key piece you need to put onto this tab, is just fill in that yellow cell with your authority code. Now we're getting into the information that's required, and something new that we've added into the application this year to make it a little bit easier for authorities to work with their data. We've created kind of a working sheet that won't have any funding information or anything like that, but it's a good resource for you to correlate your data, put your information in together for each of your students. And I know it's a little bit hard to see this. I don't think I can zoom it. Let me see if I can make it. It's not going to let me, I don't think. At the top, you're going to need for each of your students, basically each of these rows is going to be your student information for each of your students that are being transported in our meet the distance criteria. So you're going to have their last name, you're going to have their first name, you're going to put their address, which could be a civic address, or it could be a legal land description, could be 911 addressing out there, whatever their address is. If you only have a box number, we would prefer their actual physical address, because you'll need to use that for determining the distance. So typically that we'll see in there. And then from here, Sally Jean's added a lot of good reminders about what you need for the rest of these columns here. And so you'll need to enter in the grade of the student. Important to enter grade 0 for ECS children. And this is all you're going to, and again, this is the application for private ECS operators, so they should all be grade 0. You're going to put in their severe disability code in there. The only disability codes that we require information for codes 41 to 44 or 46. If they're code 45 or 47 or 48, you wouldn't put that information in there. And then the next few cells are pretty straightforward. You've got your Alberta student number, the distance to the school, the route that they're on. Key piece on the distance piece, put it to 2 decimal places. So if it's 2.1, then it's entered as 2.10. There's no rounding, so 5.46 doesn't round up to 5.5. It needs to be to 2 decimal places, so keep that in mind. Then you're going to enter information here as far as their route. Like I said, you're going to put in whether if they have a bus route number. If they're on a yellow bus, you can put in the route number 123 or whatever it is. Or if they're on a parent or a taxi or aid, you're going to put that particular information in there, because that will. You have to be careful. You have to be specific on how you put that information in there, because it will help to determine how funding is generated. School code, you're going to put the school code. Probably if you're an authority of one school, it's going to be the same code for every student. Then you're just going to put their pickup information in there. And so what we're looking for is the time for their pickup on their way to school, which is usually in the morning. And then it'll be the time of their drop off at the school. For students, especially for ECS students that are in ECS program that maybe is an afternoon program, they would just put their lunchtime pickup time and then what time they get to the school. We're just using that information just to help gather some information about ride times and whatnot. So you would just put the time in there. You don't have to put AM or PM in there. And certainly if, like I said, if they're on an afternoon program and they're getting picked up at 12:10 or something like that and get dropped off at 12:40, then you just put that information in there instead of it doesn't have to be at 8 in the morning. So that's the basic information that you need. The students' last name, first name, their address, their grade, their special disability code, severe disability code if they have one, their Alberta student number, and then their distance and routing information. And then the school authority code, and then the pickup and drop off time. So this sheet allows you to put all that information in there. You cut and paste, you can delete rows, you can sort things, you have full flexibility to work with your data in this tab in particular. And it's highlighted in yellow. It's called the working sheet. And I guess when I talk about the flexibility piece that you have in this tab, it's really important because when you get to the actual regular student tab, we have a lot of formulas at the end of this tab of the spreadsheet that make it really difficult to give people the options to sort data and delete rows and add rows because it ends up corrupting the formulas. We have a lot of formulas built in behind the scenes in this tab, and so this information is fairly locked down. You can't delete anything over in these columns where there's calculations being done. You can certainly enter in information here. And I think the expectation is you would go from your working tab. It's all the exact same columns, and then go to your regular student tab. And then you would put all any students that are on a regular route, you would copy them into here, and you just copy them right from your working sheet and it'd be just good to go. So again, if you've entered in your jurisdiction ID correctly here, you'll see it here, but then you'll also see it at the top of this page as well. It'll show there as well as your authority code. So again, all the same information that's on the working sheet is required here. The only difference here is now we're calculating the funding amounts. So you can't add rows, delete rows and stuff like that. If you put in a student's distance wrong, you typed it wrong somewhere and you just need to change it, you can change individual cells, but you are limited on what you can delete or add within this tab. This is the regular student tab. The same thing for the special transportation tab. Again, these is only for students that can't ride a regular route due to the nature of the disability. Again, all the same student information, then you just put the route and distance information in there. Some additional information that we haven't always collected from ECS operators in the past is bus route information. So you're going to enter that information in this year. Same thing for independent schools. We'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of these slides are very similar. The buses tab provides information with regards to each of your individual bus routes. And it's an important piece of information because for students for bus routes that qualify for fuel price contingency funding, we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. This bus route information will help calculate what those funding amounts are for the upcoming school year. What we'll do for the fuel price contingency program in the fall until we get your applications is we'll just continue with the same allocation amount based on the mileage that you submitted this year. And then we'll update it once we get your application, and we'll do an update in January, February, once we get your application and process it. And then we'll retroactively, if your total kilometers has gone up, then we'll retroactively adjust the payments back to the beginning of September. So really important that we get information here. You have your bus route information in here. You're not putting parents' routes or anything like that, or taxi or anything like that. That's specific to yellow bus route information that you're putting in here. Talk about the daily route distance here in a moment. The next slide talks a little bit about how we calculate that. And then the rest is pretty straightforward. What time does the bus get to the school? Capacity, 72 passengers, 54 passengers, 24 passengers, whatever it ends up being. The year the bus is made, the fuel type. And so we list the fuel types here. You're going to put either diesel, D for diesel, propane, gas. We have E in there for electric, but I don't think we have actually listed in the fuel types here, but that's part of that too, or O for other, because certainly we're starting to see a few electric buses that come out there. And then contract type, you just put whether it's a board owned, you own your own buses, your driver's employed by your authority, then we would consider a board owned, or fleet contracted, or which would be a smaller outfit like Southland or First Student or Golden Arrow. If it's a smaller independent contractor that just has a handful of bus routes, and you would just put an I there for that. And then what'll happen on here is based on this bus route information, any students that are on these two tabs, it'll count the students that have the same bus route here. So if a student's on bus route 1, 2, 3, then on this tab here, we enter in bus route 1, 2, 3, it'll list all the students on your student tabs that are assigned to that bus route. So we would expect that this total number should match pretty close with the number of students that are on yellow bus. So that's something of a double check that we do. And then a key piece for us, just for the fuel price contingency standpoint, because we want to make sure we are providing applying the correct consumption factor. You're going to put in a rural or urban, depending on the route that where the route is operating. Sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge. Like certainly if you're operating strictly in a metro area, they're all going to be urban routes, but maybe you have a situation where your school authority maybe is outside of town and you're picking up a bunch of students in Edmonton, and then that bus is just coming out to your school just on the outskirts of town. That would still be considered an urban route. And then vice versa, if you're picking up students, let's say your school is located in Calgary and you're picking up students outside of Calgary, but not in Airdrie or Cochrane or Chestermere or something like that. If they're in a rural area, that's then the majority of those students are on that bus are being picked up in the rural area. Maybe it's coming into town and maybe picking up a handful of students in town. Then you would consider that. Then you determine it based on the majority of students that are on the bus. So the majority of students that are on the bus that are being picked up are picked up in the urban area, then you call that an urban route, or if it's rural, you call it a rural route. So if you're not sure about that, certainly reach out to myself or Sally Jean. We can help you walk through that. We expect obviously to be lots of questions from people as they go through these applications this fall. Talk a little bit about the schools tab. This is basic information just to see how many students are attending each of the schools. We expect most authorities only have maybe 1 or 2 school codes here with their name, their first bell, and then the total number of students transported should match up with the number of students on the special student tab or the regular student tab, or both. I think we missed in our presentation, we'll add it afterwards, is that explain how to do the fuel mileage. I think we do it in the independent funding, in the independent application section. So we'll talk about that as well. Again, for the funding for independent schools, again, a lot of this information will be very similar to the information I just reviewed for ECS operators. All the same deadlines. Application end of November, applications be sent out by the end of September, SharePoint site, all that stuff. Again, very similar, but there's a few more tabs in this application for urban versus rural students. And so that's the big difference. As far as for ECS operators, whether their student resides in a rural or an urban area, it's the same rate for all of them, 703 or 4,000, depending if they're regular or special transportation. So the key piece here is just talking about some of the tabs that are different. We have the instructions page, same thing, you have an application page. Obviously, if you compare this one to the ECS one, a lot less data on this one. We're just talking about, we're not differentiating between rural and urban. We're just basically rural, regular, and special. But when we go down to this tab, obviously a lot more differentiation. Again, I apologize, I can't zoom this, but you're going to have both regular and rural, and then you're going to have special transportation as well. So I think the top part here is urban, and then the bottom part is rural. So the blue section up here is urban, and then urban special, and then you're going to have rural transportation and rural special. And basically what this page is going to summarize all the student information that you put on the other tabs. Then you have your working sheet. One thing to keep in mind of, and invariably, we're going to have to work this through for the school authorities with a few school authorities. But if you're copying data from an SIS system, sometimes data might come into the spreadsheet as text, even though it looks like a number. So just keep an eye on that as well. If you see something with a little green triangle in the corner of the cell, it usually indicates it's being saved as text instead of a numeric value, which may cause some challenges when it comes down to this tab. I'll go back a second here, but just if any of these figures, particularly distance or route or grade are in a numeric factor, you might not get a funding out calculation in here. So just make sure your data is in numeric, not text formatting. Again, going back to the working sheet, both applications for ECS operators and independent schools have this working page this year to help you work with your data and make sure it's all accurate in the way you want it. So this is definitely a good place to start by entering into your information or copying it from other resources. So again, all the same information that's required in there, distance, road number, school code, it's all the exact same columns. We also have a tab in here. We'll ask for information on school fees. So if you are charging transportation fees, you'll click the down arrow here and enter in yes or no. And then you put your fee amounts in here, depending if it's for ineligible students or eligible students. You would put that information in there. Maybe for all of you, you're just charging a fee for those that are actually riding the bus. So you might be just filling out this section. So that's the fees tab is one of the differences with the independent school application. And then one of the differences is that instead of just having one regular student tab and one special tab, we've now break it out between urban and rural. So you've got an urban student tab or urban special tab, and then a rural regular student tab, and then you've got a rural special tab. So we'll talk about those tabs here for the next few slides. So again, we've talked about this already, all the same information that you would put on, the same information we talked about in the working sheet is required here. So you can copy it over there for all of your urban students, copy it into there. And then you've got special transportation, any students that might be on a special transportation route. Like I said, I think for most independent schools, you're going to be either you're going to be here or you're going to be here, not going to be both typically. So if you have students on both, then we're probably going to ask, are you operating a separate segregated special transportation route for students or not? So certainly there are some independent schools that just their student population is only severe students. And so they might, all their students might be on here, but for the most part, I would expect most students would be claimed on just the regular urban student tab base if they reside in an urban population center of greater than 10,000. We talked about the special. The urban student and the rural student tabs are exactly the same. So this tab, although it points to in the demonstration here to the urban student tab, the rural student tab is exactly the same. One thing that's different is going to count the data is required the same. It's just the funding is going to calculate differently. So in the urban tab, we're going to calculate based on those base rates of 512 or 557, depending on the size of the population center. And on the rural student tab, it's going to be all the same information, but the formula is going to calculate based on the base rate of the school jurisdiction where your authority is located. So. And then same thing, the urban special and the rural special tabs are the same. You're going to enter in all the same information for kindergarten to grade 12 students that are riding on a separate bus route if they can't ride a regular bus. And then we've got the buses tab as well. This applies to both ECS operators and independent schools. How to calculate the daily route distance. If you have questions, certainly reach out to Sally Jean, but well, actually, this calculation is actually defined in the glossary terms of the funding manual, so you can always find it there, but we've tried to provide it in kind of plain language here. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the bus route from the first stop in the morning, not from when the driver leaves their yard, but from the first pickup in the morning. You're going to calculate the distance, whatever route they drive, from the first pickup to the school that they're going to. And if they drop off more than one school, then to the last school that they're going to. And then you're going to calculate the most direct distance on traveled roads back to the first pickup. And so that's your morning route distance. For most operators, it should be fairly easy to figure out. It's going to be your route distance for your route from the first stop to the school they're going to. And then you might just have to figure it out in Google Maps figure out the most direct route from the school back to the first stop. Or you can ask the driver to drive that route back for you just to calculate that. So that's going to be your morning distance. And then your afternoon distance is kind of the reverse. It's going to be taken from the first school that the bus picks up students at and to the last drop off. Once the last student's dropped off, that's the end of the afternoon route. And then you would calculate, then you would add to that distance criteria in the afternoon, the most direct distance back to the school at the end of the school day. And so then you'd add these two distances together to determine the daily route kilometers. This is something we get questions on quite a bit every year. So if you're unsure how to do the calculation, just feel free to reach out. Then we've got the schools tab here as well, very similar information. And something we're going to look at here is the total transported students is going to equal the number of students that you're claiming on all of these tabs here. That's kind of just a double check to make sure that we've got the right school information and that all the students are calculating properly and add up. So we do a few double checks when the application comes in, just make sure there's reasonableness as far as make sure all the numbers match up. And again, similar information is what we provided before. You're going to have the route. So I talked about the buses tab already, schools tab. So that's all the information there. So two fairly similar applications for private ECS operators in independent schools. The big difference is just, like I've said a couple of times, the independent school has a breakdown between rural and urban, regular and special. So there's 4 tabs here for student information, whereas the private ECS tab just has, our private ECS application just has 2 tabs in there. So when we send the applications out, we'll probably send both applications out. So take note of which one applies to your situation. They'll be very clearly labeled. Make sure that, you know, if you're an ECS operator, you won't be able to enter your, and you try to use the independent school application, likely you won't be able to enter in your authority code here. It won't accept it. So if you're having trouble entering your authority code here, you might have the wrong application. And it says at the top here what it is. So what else? Before we kind of get into a couple underfunding pieces, I mean, we'll provide some of this information in the fall about how to submit your application and whatnot. Key thing is that it's a lot easier for us if we don't get 55 applications that all say 22, 23, 24 independent school transportation application. We save all those in one folder, and it's going to be pretty hard pretty quickly for us to differentiate which application is who. The simplest thing you can do is just save the application based on your authority code. Just put your 4-digit code in there and then upload it like that, because that's the easiest way for us to look up, because ultimately we'll rename it to that as well anyways. We'll put some of that information in there. It is included in the instructions tab. I know it's hard to read, but at the bottom of the instructions tab, it does talk about, if you scroll that, when you're on the actual spreadsheet, you can scroll down and see that information. But yeah, save it under your authority code at a minimum, if you still want to call it, you know, authority code 9678. Transportation application, that's okay. As long as there's something that differentiates and is a unique identifier for your authority, that really helps us out when we're getting multiple applications coming in through SharePoint. A little bit about fuel price contingency funding. Many authorities were happy when the minister extended this funding to include independent schools and ECS operators as well. So we've gathered a lot of information this year to provide the funding. And that funding will continue to be provided this fall as long as the average price of diesel in the province exceeds $1.25 per liter. Funding is based obviously on the total mileage for your school bus routes, including your afternoon routes or your noon routes. We'll include those as well. Consumption rate is based on there's 2 different consumption rates. So basically we'll take your total kilometers and figure out how much fuel you use per day for each of those routes. And then be based on a 3.09 kilometer per liter consumption rate for rural routes, and then a 2.5 kilometers per liter for urban routes. Typically urban routes are driving lower kilometers, and typically their consumption is a little bit more. And so it's only you can only get 2.5 kilometers per liter of fuel versus that rural routes that are a little bit more. Like I said, funding is provided if the average monthly price of diesel exceeds $1.25 a liter. And we pull that information from a fuel price marketer out of Calgary called Kent Petroleum Services, I'm pretty sure. I'll look it up if you remember the name. But anyways, they provide daily pricing. And so we go in there and we pull their weekly pricing at the end of every month. It posts every Tuesday. And so we'll take the average price from 5 locations in the province: Lethbridge, Calgary, Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer. So those 5 locations would be where we would get that information from. And so then we determine the average price in the province, and certainly recognize that that average price might not be reflective of what the price is that you're paying in your local jurisdiction. Might be higher, might be lower. But we have to provide a standard source to get that pricing from them. So that's how we've always administered the program, is getting those pricing from those 5 locations that typically are fairly representative of pricing in all areas of the province. It's been interesting. Pricing down in Lethbridge has actually been the highest of anywhere, and Grand Prairie has been the lowest, which kind of is different than what we've seen in the past. But we'll calculate the average amount and apply it to your mileages that you have for this year for the funding for the fall. And then we'll update those mileage amounts once we get your applications, and we'll update those payments in January, February, the 2024. If you need more information on the funding for fuel price, you can just go into section C322.2.6 of the funding manual, and that'll provide further details on how we do the calculation. We're almost done here. Something we're getting lots of questions on is the school bus driver grant program. Something that was announced as part of budget 2023 to provide funding to support the training of new Class 2 S school bus drivers and Class 4S school bus drivers to help attract new drivers into the industry. And so this funding here is a full funding amount. There's no 70% applied to it or at all. We're just putting the final touches. And I've said this to a few people, maybe not in this call, but I know I've had a few authorities ask for it because we're accepting applications quarterly. So the first quarter will be ending at the end of June, from April 1st to the end of June. We are accepting applications on a quarterly basis. And so if any of you have your own buses and are training new bus drivers, whether it's for a Class 2S license or a Class 4S license, you would be able to apply for this funding. If you contract out to a school bus contractor, whether it's a bigger contractor or a mom and pop contractor, you could also apply for them. If that contractor has trained a new driver that's operating on your route, you can claim funding on their behalf. And then you would get $4,000 for a new Class 2 driver, which would be driving the big school buses, or a Class 4 driver that would be driving 24 passenger or less buses. And so the funding amounts are here, obviously $4,000 and $2,000. And then a portion of those dollars are intended to go directly to the driver. So for the Class 2S, $1,200 of that $4,000 is intended to go to the driver once they've completed their training and are operating on your route. Those dollars are intended to go to the driver as a bit of a training bonus for completing the time it takes to complete the training to get your Class 2. And then for Class 4S, because it's not as rigorous to get your Class 4S license, takes a lot less time. It's $600 for Class 2, Class 4 bus drivers. And so at a minimum, those amounts of each of these allocations should be flowed through to your driver, either as your employee or to your contractor to reimburse their employee. And then the remainder of the funding, depending on who's bearing the cost of the training. Obviously, if you have your own fleet, you're doing your own training, you're bearing the cost. If it's your contractor that's doing the training, that's a conversation that you'll have to have with your contractor on who's bearing that cost. Someone might flow to the contractor. Some authorities might feel that it's built into the rates that they're already paying and might use that to help support that. So trying to stay out of those conversations, that's something that you'd have to discuss with your contractor, because certainly there's some bigger contractors that might be expecting the $4,000 or $2,000 to come to them. Some other points on here. Just on the funding of this, we get questions about this. What if we're training a new driver that's just doing field trips during the day and whatnot? You would not be able to claim funding for a new driver for that. This is specifically funding to help attract and train new school bus drivers, because as many of you know, there's been a shortage of school bus drivers. Some would say for many years, but it's been more severe of an issue this year for sure. And so we're trying to provide this funding to, especially the $1,200 and $600 training bonuses to attract people to put their application in and commit the time to become a school bus driver, because it does take a little bit of time to do the training. There's another piece that we're weaving into this as well. Some of you might be familiar with the mandatory entry-level training requirements that used to be required for Class 2S. Alberta Transportation removed those mandatory training requirements from Class 2S in April. But they do want to provide some funding to support driver competency training for new bus drivers in their first 6 months of hire. And so there'll be a portion of this application that you can hire, you can apply for driver competency training reimbursement as well. So if you have questions about that, we'll definitely have all that in the program, and you can certainly reach out to myself and Sally Jean once the applications go out. Open next week. I've been saying that for a couple of weeks now, but really working hard to get it done by the end of next week, and so that everybody can have those applications before the end of the quarter and get them submitted by middle of July, hopefully. Certainly we'll see in some situations, you might be trained a new driver that started driving in the last month or two. You might have two claims for that driver. You might have one claim now where you're going to claim the 4,000 or the 2,000, and then you might submit another claim in the fall once they've gone through their first 3 or 6 months of training of driving, and they're still with you, and they've completed their competency training where they have a senior driver that provides some support for the student, for the new driver, as far as things like defensive driving and student management and whatnot. And so there'll be more information in the driver application package on what those competencies are. So again, the applications will be submitted quarterly, and the application packages will be going out next week. And if you need more information, you can find that in C3 2.7 of the manual. All right, that's me doing a lot of talking. Maybe just while people are fresh, and so I don't want to miss any questions.
I do have the one question, if it's an obligation to provide parent-provided transportation, and there's absolutely no obligation to provide parent-provided transportation. If you apply on behalf of the parent and receive funding from Alberta Education, then you are obligated to reimburse the parent. However, it's not an obligation to apply or reimburse.
Yeah, there's no obligation to provide any transportation for these students. Obviously, most of you are on this call, either you're curious about what this funding is or you're already doing it. So hopefully you have an understanding of what your policies are.
Question just came in. Do we get funding for taxis or aids for non-ECS? Yes, if you transport grades 1 to 12 by a taxi or aid, you will receive transportation funding for them as well. It depends on if you're transporting a student on by taxi or aid. If they have a severe disability where they weren't able to ride a regular route, then you would be putting those students on the special tab.
This is Jocelyn Forrester.
Who are you with, Jocelyn? Sorry.
Delta West Academy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So I had asked a question if it was required for us to offer. So earlier in the chat, the response was the message refers to school boards, not independent or ECS operators. School boards in the 24-25 school year will be obligated to provide for transportation of students. However, for the 23-24 school year, they will be funded if they choose. So I know we got the question if we're obligated for, the answer is if we're obligated to apply for parents, but my question is that just for the upcoming school year, and then after that going forward we will have to, or it's always going to be our choice?
Always your choice.
Okay.
Yeah, and when I stated that was a question in regards to the 2.4 kilometers, because I was getting a lot of questions on that, and the only reason that we state the 2.4, that whole conversation was based that for the 24-25 school year, school boards will be obligated to transport students at the 1 and 2 kilometer eligibility rates. But for this year, if they choose to implement it, then we will fund them for it. But there's no obligation between 1 and 2.4 kilometers for them to transport, but it does not apply to independent schools and ECS.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, it was just kind of mixed in with a whole bunch of questions, so I wasn't sure exactly which part it was responding to. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for everybody on this call, I would think you have 100% flexibility in when you want to provide service, either for all your students or a portion of your students. Other questions in the chat. Transportation policy. We don't have a sample of a policy. Maybe reach out to colleagues, maybe ASCA. If you remember ASCA, maybe you can reach out to them and get a policy. Sally Jean, any other thoughts on that one?
The only thing that I would suggest is if you look up the local public or separate school division within your area, and you can research their transportation policy off their website, and then it would align with, you could align that with yours.
That's a good idea. Question here about email letting us know when the application is posted to SharePoint. Yes, you will get an email and the application will be included within the email. We certainly have no problems emailing out blank applications, but once they have student information in there, then it needs to be sent via SharePoint. So back to us by SharePoint, but we will definitely send it out by email.
Yeah, and then there's more questions about clarification with non-ECS that are using taxi or aid. If they're using a taxi or aid and would be able to be transported on a regular route, then you would just claim those students on the regular urban or regular rural tab. And it would be no different as if they were on a bus or not. So they'd get the same rate as if they were on a bus. And then also now,
I'll just jump in on that one. I think the key thing to remember is that you will get funding if you're providing service. Whether they what rate they qualify for will be depending on the ability of the student. So just if they're on a taxi, we'll fund it, even if they're not on a yellow bus. But how they're funded would determine on whether they qualify for a regular student as a regular rider or as a special rider.
and then also question here now about wondering why our transportation funding on our application is quite low compared with when we calculate the amount based on most students living further away and being transported by parent. That's because parent provided is a flat rate. It does not matter if they're transporting their child 30 kilometers or 3 kilometers. It's a flat rate for parent provided.
Email to get access to the transportation funding portal. I'll walk through that in a second. 2 students in a family being transported. Yeah, you just need to do one.
You need to do one parent provided agreement, but you can claim them both on the transportation application. You will receive funding for both of the students, but you were only obligated to pay that family for one of the children. And that's so, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, you definitely need to put them all on there. You don't claim on the application by family. Each individual student needs to be on the application.
Rick or Sally Jean, I'm happy to take this offline if you think it's appropriate, but given where STS is located almost exactly between Okotoks and Calgary, most of our students originate urban, but they drive outside the city. What are we considered?
You claim the children or students based on where they reside, not where your program is.
Very good, thank you.
Because even if you're in an urban area and you're transporting from outside the city, you would claim the students from their residence, which would be either rural or urban.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the rate will be a little bit lower, Jody, for an urban student, but you'll catch up on the distance, because obviously the distance will be a lot longer than it would be for a student that's coming from Okotoks or something like that. So.
And there's a question if they need to upload their busing contracts for each parent. If students are transported by bus, it's important to keep that bus list at your program, but you're not obligated to upload your bus route lists, but we will require parent provided agreements. And everyone should have a school authority code.
Yeah, Keith, sorry, we're not going to put that in writing. That's up to your local policy. Certainly if a family called us to say, how come I'm not getting 703, or I guess if it was 492 for a grade 1 to 12 student, that's up to local policy.
Can I just ask if we don't offer, like if we don't end up reimbursing both, like if we have two students from the same family and we just reimburse the parents for one, what do we do with the rest, like with the other 703 or whatever it is? Like, does that apply if we're going, like, because we're not always going to know if we are going to get students that are not going to be funded later on in the school year. So what does that look like in terms of, giving that money back or putting it into other things? Like, I just want to make sure that I'm very clear on what the expectation is if that money doesn't go to parents.
Yeah, it's a fair question, because transportation funding is targeted, right? And maybe I've created more confusion with that statement than maybe was intended, but maybe it's just simpler. You just reimburse all your students and then you don't have to worry about funding that's not targeted. And the reason why we provide that flexibility in how you reimburse is because, especially for bigger authorities, you have more students that are coming in and out of your program throughout the year. And maybe you want to provide some transportation support for somebody who comes into the program in January, but they have to wait till September. But like you said, you might not get any new students between November and June. And it might be just simpler for you just to reimburse all those students. Then you're not worried about whether you have extra dollars at the end of the year and you just offer parent provided, so you have no real place to spend those dollars. It might be just simpler for you to just reimburse all your students, but really it's up to each individual authority to decide what works best.
Yeah, with the parent provided agreement, it's between your authority and the parent. And the parent is the one who's going to be reimbursed the amount. And if they have their son or their own child drive themselves, that would be up to the money goes to the parent. And if the parent wishes to transfer that funding to their children, they may do so. Sorry, I was just going to add, if a sibling is if the sibling is the legal guardian of the child, yes, but not if it's not the legal guardian.
And I realize there'll be a lot of individual situations here that, if you have something you're not sure of, just send us an email. Like some of these are going to be scenarios that we haven't come across either. So
also just one add, if they do parent provided, or if the parent drives them in the morning and then they take the bus in the afternoon, they can only be claimed either as parent provided or by bus.
this question about a student that maybe student's not special needs, but the parent is not able to drive, and so they put them on a taxi. Yeah, I think however the parent decides to provide that, we're not going to worry about that. You would reimburse the parent, and then if they choose to drive their child, and that's their method, or if they decide to put them on transit or have a neighbor drive them or whatever, that would be up to the parent to decide how they're going to do it. But you're entering into an agreement that you're going to reimburse the parent for transportation, and how they decide to do that would be up to them.
Yeah, so I just have a question on shared responsibility students. It's really hard to tell which funding they are eligible for. That is the campus portion, right? If they're doing campus and home ed, do they get transportation funding for the campus portion of the program, or is this one of those categories they don't get funded?
If a student's in shared responsibility, both part home ed and part schooling, if they take 50% of their classes at your program, are enrolled and being transported more than 50% of the time, they would be eligible for transportation funding.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just, Mary Lou, can I just add on to that? Thank you, Vic, for asking that question. At the percentage of the shared responsibility or not? Or the full amount when you said they're eligible? My guess is it's the amount of the shared responsibility.
It would be the full amount for transportation funding, regardless if a student is part-time or full-time, as long as they're enrolled and being transported more than 50% of the time to your program, they're eligible for the full transportation amount. We don't do partial payment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a key piece, especially if they're enrolled in another school authority and we have priority school conflicts. If the other school authority is deemed to be the home of the student for the majority of the instructional funding, you might not be able to claim that student. And we do checks on the students when they get submitted.
And then we got a question about joint custody situations.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. We always get that one.
You can go ahead, Rick. I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, determining eligibility is always a tricky one. I mean, you're going to only have, in the Education Act, you can only have one residence. And so you're going to be claiming the transportation funding based on the address that the student's registered under. Usually it's mom's, but it might be dad's sometimes too. But however that student's registered, and we'll see those addresses in PASI, that'll be considered their resident address, and you're going to provide their eligibility based on that. If they're split between the families, I mean, obviously, I need to understand a little bit more of the question, I guess. But if you're doing parent provided, you would just have an agreement with the one parent, I guess, and then they would have to decide if they want to split it with their spouse or not. You wouldn't have to. I've never heard of an authority having two different agreements for half the amount for mom and half the agreement for dad. That being said, well, maybe that hasn't happened. I don't know. To think that through a little bit, but typically, I've never heard anybody splitting a parent provided that way. And then from a busing standpoint, I mean, you don't have to offer transportation at all. It would be up to you whether it fits within your routing system if you wanted to transport from both locations or not. It's not quite what you're asking about, but it does come up quite often too. And then how you pay them, yeah, you'd reimburse them on the full amount, even if they're only driving every second week. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. If we have some more questions, we'll hopefully have some time at the end here. I'm just going to walk through a couple of the documents that I shared, and I'll share them here again at the end of the chat before everybody goes. Share my screen properly again. So if you go into good old Google or wherever your search engine is and just type in Alberta Education, that's going to take us to our main webpage. That's the way I do it all the time. I think I have it bookmarked here somewhere too, but if I want to get into the extranet or provincial education directory, I'll just go this way. And you're just going to click on this. Then you're going to see when you get into the education page, you're going to see a little login button on the top left side. And on the slide, it talks about those steps. And then you open up that, and that's going to open up kind of a little sub window here with the provincial education directory. And here's where you're going to click the login again. So you're clicking in login here, and then you're clicking in the login here. And then you're going to get to this new window. And here's where for us, for government, we just put our GOA domain in here and it's all good. But if you don't have a user extranet password or an account, you're going to enter in your jurisdiction information right here. And then you're going to say, I'm new, sign me up. And then you're going to click on sign in. I don't even think you do a password here. Maybe you do actually. I think you put in your email, make up your password. I'm new, sign you up. And then it's going to walk you through all the steps of how to get set up with an extranet password. It's hard for me to demonstrate it because I already have an account, but that would be the general process that you're going to do to figure that out. It seems fairly straightforward. This talks a little bit about too how to get your application and whatnot. And certainly you can reach out. I'm sorry if I'm going through this quickly, but this is a form that you'll have to fill out, and you'll have once you have your profile, then you complete this request form at the bottom. If you have any questions, certainly reach out to this help desk here. You can see the information right here. That would be a good place to ask. And if you're having troubles not getting a response, just reach out to Sally Jean or myself. But then you're going to just put in your account number, your name, and everything like that. They won't be able to, and this is the form you're going to use not to get an extranet account. This is a form you're going to use to request access to the Strategic Financial Services SharePoint site. And so you're going to go through all this to get that. So once you go through this other step to get set up, you're new, you get your extranet account, and then usually once you've logged in, my screen's blocked, but usually it'll show up here, your user, it'll show your profile and your name and all that kind of stuff on the top right corner. Then you can, and I'll just go in here just so that people can see what to do. Once you're into the SharePoint site, it's going to have your profile and everything in the top right corner. And there's all kinds of different things under here. You can access past community site, whatnot. You can download the forms. So if you want to download, the form can be found right here. Want to update your information is here. But ultimately, once you're in there and you're set up and you send, sorry, I'm switching around lots. Sorry if it's going too quickly, but this one. Once you're set up on SharePoint, then you're going to submit this different form to give you access to the SharePoint site. And so you have to submit one form for each applicant. So you have one or two different people in your organization to get access to it. You're going to submit it to this ae.helpdesk@gov.ab.ca. You can put all your information over 2 pages, scan it, and send it to that email address, and they'll get you set up. You might already have set up to some of these. Like I said, you might be set up to the school finance, to the BOSS community site. That's our branch BOSS, business operations and stakeholder support. You might be already set up for monitoring, but transportation is the one here that you might not have had access to before. So get rid of access of somebody, you can submit that in, I guess, as a secretary treasurer. Somebody's left your organization, but you can also manage that, I think, online as well, but just delete their account. But if you're mostly for setting up a new account, you're going to put all this information, obviously fill out all the information that's required, and then you're going to email it to that address up here. Right there, Workforce Development Help Desk. So sometimes people are a little unsure about that, but the key is, like I said before, is to go through and get set up on the SharePoint site. You can do the login. You can do the login. I'm already logged in, so it's going to take me right there again anyways. But, and then once you're in there, then you're going to go into this, you're going to see this window will pop up, and you're going to have this Strategic Financial Services, and you're going to launch this. Hopefully this doesn't take a million seconds to do. No, it's not too bad. So here's the actual SharePoint site. And some of you, like I said, if you look at the top, will be the different areas of SharePoint. So this is kind of the main SharePoint page. And then there's all these sub pages where you would put information. And it's tricky because some of it will look very similar. BOSS compliance monitoring site says it'll have all of these jurisdiction folders in here. For me, I see all of them because obviously at the user end, we want to be access to all of them. But you might see one folder here with your jurisdiction in here. But if you go to the transportation one, it looks very similar. So the key is to make sure you're at the top in transportation and not in a different SharePoint site that you might already have access to. Because if you copy and paste your application, you'll You're not going to see everybody's folder here. Obviously, there's just going to be one folder for your authority here. If you copy it into here, we won't get a notification that it's there. And so it's really important that you get set up on the transportation site, and you then put your applications in there, because we'll set up reminders on our end to let us know anytime a file has been downloaded. Usually just get a reminder once a day of who's submitted, and then we go in and clean them out once a day. And so that's why it's really important that you put your own individual authority ID in there with your application, because, you know, we'll be copying over, especially at the end of November, we'll be copying over multiple applications every day into our folder for processing. And obviously, if we have multiple applications with the same generic application forms name without your unique authority identifier, then it's important to do that. I know somebody asked in the chat, I kind of remembered and then I didn't answer it. Everybody, you should already have a school authority ID already. You should already have an authority ID for your authority. You might not know what it is. Check with others in your organization, I guess, to figure out what your authority ID is, and that's something maybe not deal with on a regular basis, but everybody would have an authority for sure. So
I know last year, or the last time I sent out applications in 1920, I'll attach once I let you know that the applications are uploaded to SharePoint, I'll send a list of all the school authorities and your authority code.
Perfect. So that's a little bit about the SharePoint site. Just quickly go into the applications real quick, just provide a bit of a live version of it. I know some of you are probably chomping to get these sooner than later, but we're probably going to tweak a couple things. Just we want to make sure that we got them 100% correct, so we're not sending out multiple versions. Again, this is the ECS application. It'll say in the file name, obviously, it says at the top here, the private ECS operators. Provides a lot of the information we talked about here between rural and special. Let's make this even a little bit bigger. The debt funding deadline, and then you got all the information you need for regular student transportation for your regular riders that don't require specialized transportation. And so obviously your last name, first name, address, all the information that we've talked about before. It's just basically all that information. So the instructions page, especially if you're new, is a really good place to print that off and just kind of go through and make sure you have the correct information. I mean, the spreadsheet's pretty straightforward because you want to make sure all the columns are populated, but it does talk about all this information and things you need to put in there. And actually it's more than what you could see in the PowerPoint. If you scroll down, you can see a lot of this information as well. So there's that contact information at the bottom. My name, how'd my number end up on there, Sally G? I'm just joking. We'll be very busy this fall, so it's quite possible you're talking to myself for Sally Jean or Eric this fall. So again, the application tab, you're just going to put in your whatever your jurisdiction ID is. Once you put it in here, once you enter it in there, it's going to show your name in there. So that'll be your verifier that you've got the right authority code in there. Then you go to the working sheet. This is again just a working spreadsheet. Put all your student information in here. Bigger, last name, first name. You're just copying all this stuff in here. So this is a really good place to work with your data. Add rows, delete rows, change information and whatnot. Once you put it into this version of the spreadsheet, your regular tab or your rural tab, you still got the opportunity. You can still put in a person's name, copy it over, and you could still delete it, the individual cell. But if I try to delete the individual row, you'll see a lot of those features are grayed out here because there's some protections on each of these tabs. So you can't go in here and delete, can't delete the formula, you can't insert rows, stuff like that. So certainly you can kind of play with the data kind of between column, so let's go over a bit, I guess column C and column M. But you can't insert columns and stuff that you can only really adjust data in individual cells. Same thing for the special, very similar information. Provides your funding amount in the end, your bus information, and your school information. And all this information on your regular and your special will then flow into here. You'll see this number will populate, this number will populate, and then there'll be funding amounts in here. So pretty straightforward on that perspective. I'll quickly go into the independent school one. Again, instructions tab is very similar. Obviously, the application tab is a little bit more detailed, where you both, like I said, you have your urban section for regular and special. You'll have your rates. The rates will populate automatically once you put your jurisdiction ID in here. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head that might be urban. I don't know. We'll pick one here, see if it comes up. Who did I pick randomly? Apologize if I picked up somebody. Third Academy. Oh, Sunil, if you're on the call, I picked you by random chance. So then as soon as you put in your authority code, it's going to put your base rates in there. So the Third Academy, their programming is based mostly in Calgary, so they're going to get the smaller rate. Parent provided is always at 703. If you're an authority in a smaller urban center, then you're going to be at 557, but you can see that your rates automatically populate as soon as you put your authority in there. Same thing for the rural, it'd be at 811 rate based on the rural rate for, I think, Rocky View. I think that's the one we use because that's the one that encompasses most of Calgary. So put all that in there. We will require in the end a signed copy of this application page, but I would suggest first put it into SharePoint. We'll review it and make sure it's correct. And once we have the finalized application, then Sally Jean will let you know, or myself, whoever's reviewing it, we'll let you know that your application is finalized, and then you can just print out a copy of this or electronically sign this and send us in a copy of the application page that's signed. So you don't have to worry about that so much at first when you submit it. The key is to get the application in on time, and then we go from there. So yeah, see, once you take the code out, then a lot of these funding rates are gone. And a lot of the same things here. You got your worksheet. You will have to put your fees piece into here. Yes or no, whether you charge fees, and then you can enter your amount. So if you do have fees, you can put your fees in here, whatever they are, $500 a student, whatever it is. I expect most people are not charging ineligible students. If they're not transporting ineligible students, that wouldn't meet the distance criteria. Maybe you are, but or maybe just charging everybody the same fee. So this should be fairly straightforward. And then from your working sheet, you might have to organize your students. If you have both urban and rural students, you might have to put your urban at the first part and then your rural at the bottom. But however you organize yourself, you can copy that information right over into this tab. As long as you're only copying the same amount of columns or less number of columns, it's going to allow you to copy in there. But you can't copy, say you copy more columns than is available. You can only copy into these ones here. It won't let you copy even into these column in or anything like that. And all these tabs are exactly the same, just urban special, rural regular, and rural special. And your bus information. Just a demonstration here about different bus route numbers and stuff like that. P taxi 8, you might have route number 123, and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully this is informative. I realize there's a lot of information to go through in a short period of time, but hopefully these give you a basic understanding. And I think once you get the application and you have an opportunity to work with your data a little bit, I think hopefully at a minimum you understand what information you need to collect from your students. It's fairly straightforward. Just getting your distance information is the key. And if you're having problems or unsure about a particular situation for a student, then you can certainly reach out to myself or Sally Jean